Okay, so the first video that we uploaded on this channel was a Limbo build that went over a very particular playstyle that not a lot of people really knew about. This video went down pretty well and the comments were very positive, and we also received a bunch of suggestions to improvements that I can make to the build. Some of them that I do agree with, and some of them which I don't agree with as much, and I'll also give my reasoning as to why in this video, particularly to do with the Helminth choices. And today I wanted to revisit this setup, not only explaining how to play it in a more concise and understandable way, and overall making the build way more refined and stronger. From different and arguably better weapon options, and to a way better Helminth option, today we're going to revisit Limbo from head to toe, and overall give a way better build than the previous video. Of course, I want to start with going over his abilities once again for anyone here that hasn't played Limbo or doesn't understand him. And I'm going to start by quickly covering his passive, his second and his fourth ability, and then after that I'm going to cover his first and his third, because those two abilities synergize particularly well together and make this playstyle what it is, and I want to go over those together so that way you guys understand the playstyle way more easily. His passive allows him to enter his dimension, the Rift, via rolling. You can roll once to enter and then roll again to exit, and when you exit you will leave a little rift tear which you and your allies can go through to re-enter. And entering the rift means that you and your enemies can't interact with each other unless you're on the same plane of existence. So I can't damage them, but they can't damage me. They're on the material plane and you are on the rift plane. And whilst in the rift, Limbo will regenerate energy over time and gain energy upon killing enemies. But it's important to note that every ability in the game that does direct damage, such as exalted abilities, can do damage through the rift. So you could banish the Excalibur on your team and he could still hit enemies outside of the rift with his exalted blade. Next up we're going to cover Stasis. Stasis will pause all enemies within the rift, freezing them in place. This will basically lock down anyone within the same plane of existence as you, but also it will lock down status procs afflicted on said enemies, meaning that if you inflict a slash proc on an enemy in stasis, that slash proc will bleed until stasis ends. His fourth ability, Cataclysm, is a big radial banish, kind of like his first ability, except it's a bubble. Casting this bubble on an area will put everything inside it within the rift. As the duration of the ability depletes, the bubble will shrink. You can build this for high range for locking down an entire room, or you can build it for lower range to avoid nullifiers. This is particularly useful for defense missions. However, this isn't an ability we're going to be using today, so I'm going to leave this here for now. Now let's get on to his 1 and his 3 and how they synergize together, explaining not only how they function but also how to use them in tandem to create this crazy rift spreading playstyle. His first ability, Banish, is a mini AoE cast that will send enemies into the rift, knocking them down. You can only cast this on enemies if you're on the same plane of existence as them. So if we're both on the material plane, I can banish them, but if I'm in the rift and they are not, I can't banish them. But this ability also possesses the option to hold down the cast so you can unbanish them, thus making them leave the rift. And this is where the synergy comes in with his third ability. His third skill, Rift Surge, primes enemies with rift energy, and any enemy that has been hit with this ability will set off a radial explosion upon leaving the rift. And what this radial explosion does is it banishes nearby enemies. So if you cast Rift Surge on a group of enemies, and then hold down your first ability to thus make them leave the rift, it will set off a radial explosion from all of those enemies that are caught in Rift Surge, and re-banish everyone that it hits within the AoE. So if you build for maximum range, you can set off massive radial banishes that will spread the rift, and of course stasis whilst it's active, basically freezing and pulling enemies into the rift all around the area, just by you banishing a group of enemies with your 1, casting 3, holding 1, casting 3, holding 1, over and over and over, and you'll gradually see that as long as you are built for maximum range, your rift will spread extremely easily and you never have to even leave the rift yourself to do this. Described it in the previous video as some sort of viral rift infection because it spreads kind of like a sarin spore, and our choice of Helminth today is also going to make this even stronger. Because we can easily spread the rift and make use of the augment rift torrent for Rift Surge, thus giving us a massive damage buff, we no longer need Cataclysm, and this is the one we're going to remove from Limbo's kit. In the previous video I used Radial Blind, and whilst that still can be useful, unfortunately Radial Blind is completely outclassed by an ability called Breach Surge, which is from Wisp. Breach Surge still possesses the same sort of radial blind, which was really useful for keeping us safe in moments where we need it and giving us stealth multipliers. But Breach Surge also causes enemies to send out projectiles that do solid scaling damage, proccing radiation and shutting other enemies down once you've killed them. And these projectiles can hit enemies that are outside the rift as well, because it is an ability that deals damage. And as stated in the previous video once again, melee influence also goes to the rift as well. So not only do we have insane amounts of stats proccing to enemies that aren't in the rift, but in a mere chance that our rift surges haven't spread to certain enemies within their area, they will still be taking large amounts of damage from both influence and breach surge. Now, another ability suggestion that I saw in the comments of the video was to use Banshee's Silence as a subsume, and this was because I was occasionally having issues with dealing with Xmas units. I do think this is a solid choice in the sense that Limbo isn't the greatest at dealing with Xmas units, as they simply won't get stuck in your stasis. Silence can help with those, but unfortunately the other uses that people are bringing up for this ability, i.e. the stealth multipliers that you get from using it with its augment Savage Silence, thus giving us basically one of the effects of Radial Blind or Breach Surge, but with the added bonus of dealing with Xmas units, hence the suggestions. Unfortunately, this area of the ability isn't really as useful as you guys might think, and that's because of the way this Limbo is built. We are built for maximum range, and in my opinion this is a must in order to spread the rift explosions. And Silence is an ability that does not function in the way that you want it when you have maximum range. Silence has a stun that unfortunately only gives stealth multipliers when you're using the Savage Silence augment. The stun takes place once you enter range of the enemies with the ability turned on, and this ability cannot be recast. The only way to recast a stun is to exit the range of the enemy and then re-enter, i.e. backing up or running away and then running back at them. So already without the augment, this ability is only going to be useful for Xmas units, but because we're built for maximum range on Limbo, which we cannot sacrifice, enemies are going to be stunned from rooms away before we even get to them, meaning that the finish animation is probably going to run out by the time we get to them, because Silence is an ability best built for base range, because it allows you to get within killing distance of the enemy, either with your gun or your melee, at least within the same room, and then tearing them down whilst they are stunned. But with high range, that stun takes place at a way further distance, and that is extremely inconvenient for the ability, especially if you want to use the augment. And to be honest, this build cannot fit the augment in anywhere. I always run base range for Silence on Banshee, because to me that's the perfect distance in which the stun takes place for how close I am to the enemy. And I do not like the ability at all with max range, because by the time I get within range of them, they're no longer stunned. So yeah, hopefully you guys understand why I'm not using Banshee's Silence. It's a decent suggestion, especially if you guys don't fuck with the Xmas. But Breach Surge in itself is still even better for dealing with Xmas than Radial Blind was, because it's sending out radiation based projectiles. As for melee weapons this time round, last time I was using the Nami Solo for my melee weapon, which was incredibly strong and still is 100% viable due to the insane amounts of slash and status, and the way it works with melee influence of course, but I figured we could use a projectile based melee weapon this time, not only because of the amount of range they have, but also because that would synergize with Breach Surge more, being able to hit enemies from further away. And in this instance I'd gone with the Incarnate weapon, the Innodem. Once you've activated the Incarnate form of the Innodem, its aerial attacks whilst you're aim gliding will send out projectiles that also make use of melee influence. It's like having a very fast aerial missile launcher, and this synergizes perfectly with this setup. Combine it with the Argonac and its Amalgam mod for that armor reduction, and then either modding this thing for electricity and gas or electricity and blast, it's completely up to you. And then of course the insane multiplier from Rift Torrent from all the enemies we're banishing, and Breach Surge. Nothing is going to stand in the way of this combo. It's worth noting that these two Archon shards here are for a different build, so these are not necessary. However, I would recommend using the Energy Max and the Casting Speed shards. And here is the build. If you're looking for a bit more safety and survivability in moments that you may need it, you could realistically replace either Transient or Umbral Intensify for Rolling Guard, and of course in that case having those two Strength shards would actually be more useful for this build as well. But in the moments where maybe you do get caught by an Xmas, or whenever you have to restart your Rift chain and maybe leave the Rift and banish someone, Brief Respite is our primary form of survivability via shield gating in these instances, and of course the stun from Breach Surge. Madarai is of course a no-brainer here for the increased strength and casting speed, and I know some of you guys will have noticed that in the run I completely forgot to have my companion on like a fucking dumbass. My excuse for this being that whenever I'm doing Captura shots I have to remove my companion and then I forget to put him back on. My personal recommendations for this build when it comes to a companion would 100% be the Panzervolk Profiler for its viral quills, and if you've got room for Archon Stretch then I'd recommend going with the Doriga. So yeah, that's about it for my refined version of the Limbo setup. Hopefully you guys found this video a bit more useful and helpful than the previous one. This build is way stronger and I definitely recommend you try it. and let me know if any of you guys have tried the Limbo playstyle. Rift spreading with these mechanics is extremely fun, however I wouldn't recommend using it in a team aspect because your teammates are going to hate you unless they've got, solid damage dealing abilities. Be sure to subscribe if you've enjoyed the content, and don't forget to follow my Twitch, link will be in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next video.